Shadows of the past. Officer Malcolm Reed sat in his patrol car, the rhythmic hum of the engine lulling the quiet suburban streets of Millbrook into a false sense of peace. He had been a police officer for over 15 years, long enough to know that trouble didn't always come with blaring sirens or flashing lights. Sometimes it crept in silently, like a thief in the night, shattering the illusion of safety. His son, Jason Reed, was a bright, kind-hearted teenager. He had always been the kind of boy who helped the underdog, who stood up for what was right, but Malcolm knew that goodness sometimes made you a target. He just never imagined that it would lead to this. The radio crackled. All units, medical emergency at Millbrook High. Repeat, medical emergency at Millbrook High. Ambulance dispatched. Possible assault victim in critical condition. Malcolm's blood ran cold. Millbrook High. Jason's school. Before he could fully process the thought, his phone buzzed. It was his wife, Martha. Malcolm. Her voice was frantic. Jason. It's Jason. He's been hurt at school. They're taking him to the hospital. They said it's serious. The world around him blurred into a tunnel of flashing red and blue as he threw the car into gear and sped toward Millbrook High. When Malcolm pulled into the school parking lot, his stomach twisted. The flashing red and white lights of an ambulance illuminated the entrance, and a crowd had gathered near the gymnasium doors. Paramedics wheeled out a stretcher, and as Malcolm stepped out of his cruiser, his breath caught in his throat. It was Jason. His son lay motionless, his face swollen and bruised beyond recognition. Blood smeared his lips, and his arms were limp at his sides. A paramedic adjusted an oxygen mask over his face, and Malcolm rushed forward, his badge flashing at the responders. "He's my son," he shouted. "Jason. Son, can you hear me?" The paramedics barely had time to react before Malcolm was beside them, gripping Jason's hand. "He's unresponsive," a young paramedic told him. "We need to get him to the hospital immediately." Malcolm nodded, barely able to breathe. He turned to the nearest teacher, Mr. Tompkins, Jason's English teacher. "What happened?" His voice was deadly calm. Mr. Tompkins swallowed hard. I don't know all the details. There was some kind of fight in the locker room after gym class. By the time we got there, Jason was already unconscious." A fight? No, this wasn't a simple fight. This was a brutal beating. Malcolm clenched his fists, his body vibrating with barely contained rage. "Who did this?" he demanded. Tompkins hesitated. "There have been issues between Jason and a group of older boys. We've tried to handle it, but—" Malcolm's eyes blazed. "You tried to handle it? My son is lying unconscious because of some issues." The teacher looked away, ashamed. The siren of the ambulance snapped Malcolm back to reality. He had no time to waste. He ran back to his cruiser and followed the flashing lights to Millbrook General Hospital, his heart hammering against his ribs. The waiting room was suffocating. Martha arrived moments later, breathless, her face pale and tear-streaked. She threw herself into Malcolm's arms. "Malcolm, what happened? Who would do this to him?" Malcolm swallowed the lump in his throat. He had no answers. The doctor arrived after what felt like an eternity. "Mr. and Mrs. Reed." His expression was grim. "I'm Dr. Patel. Your son has suffered extensive internal injuries, including multiple broken ribs, a collapsed lung, and damage to his liver. We've stabilized him for now, but—" Malcolm knew there was a but. Dr. Patel hesitated. "He's going to need a liver transplant." Martha gasped, her hands covering her mouth. Malcolm felt the ground shift beneath him. "A transplant?" His voice was hoarse. Dr. Patel nodded. "We've placed him on the donor list, but given his condition, time is critical. If either of you is a match, a living donor transplant would be the best option." Malcolm gripped his wife's hand. "We'll do whatever it takes." The doctor nodded. "We'll begin testing immediately." Malcolm took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. But the storm in his chest was growing stronger. He turned to Martha. "This wasn't just some schoolyard fight," he whispered. "Someone wanted to hurt him. Badly." Martha's eyes brimmed with tears. "We have to find out who did this." Malcolm's jaw tightened. "I already have a few names." That night, while waiting for the test results, Malcolm called his partner, Detective Saracen. "I need you to dig into something for me," Malcolm said. "Bullying reports. Millbrook High. Look into a group of seniors. Tyler Johnson, Marcus Delaney, and Chris Hoffman. I want everything you can find." There was a pause. "Mal, you sure you want to go down this road? You're personally involved." Malcolm's grip tightened on the phone. "They put my son in a hospital bed. Saracen. They nearly killed him. I will go down this road." Saracen sighed. "All right, I'll get you what you need." The test results came back in the morning. Neither Malcolm nor Martha was a match. Dr. Paddle delivered the news with a heavy heart. "We'll continue searching for a donor, but the clock is ticking." Malcolm clenched his fists, a helpless rage building inside him. Then a quiet voice interrupted. "I want to be tested." Malcolm turned. A young nurse stood there. She looked nervous but determined. "I'm Nancy. I work in the ER. I heard about Jason's situation, and I want to see if I'm a match." Malcolm stared at her, stunned. You don't even know us." Nancy smiled softly. "I was bullied too. Not as badly as Jason, but I know how it feels. If I can help, I want to." For the first time in what felt like forever, hope flickered in Malcolm's chest. "Thank you," he whispered. As Nancy underwent testing, Malcolm met with Saracen, who had dug into the case. "It's worse than we thought, Mal," Saracen said grimly. "Jason's been getting harassed for months. Teachers reported it, but the school brushed it under the rug. The principal, Dr. Simmons, he's got a history of covering up bullying cases." Malcolm felt his blood turn to ice. "They've gotten away with this for too long," he growled. "Not anymore." Saracen hesitated. "There's one more thing. Jason reported an incident last month. A pretty bad one. But instead of helping, Dr. Simmons suspended Jason for provoking the other students." Malcolm's hands clenched into fists. That was it. The school had protected these bullies while his son suffered. No more. Taking a deep breath, he straightened his shoulders. "It's time we bring them down." Malcolm had fought criminals before. But this was personal. And he was going to make damn sure that the people who hurt his son, and those who enabled them, would face justice. And as he looked at Jason's unconscious form, his heart filled with an unshakable resolve. This was only the beginning. A father's wrath. Malcolm sat in the dimly lit hospital corridor, his mind a storm of anger, grief, and guilt. His son lay unconscious just beyond the heavy wooden door, hooked up to beeping machines that monitored his every heartbeat. Jason, his strong, kind-hearted boy, was fighting for his life. And the people responsible, they were likely still walking free, laughing, living their lives as if nothing had happened. That thought sent a fresh wave of rage burning through Malcolm's veins. He had been a police officer for over 15 years. He had seen the worst humanity had to offer. But nothing compared to the fury of a father whose child had been broken before his eyes. His phone buzzed. It was Detective Saracen. "Mal, I've been digging." Saracen's voice was tight, serious. "You were right. The bullying wasn't just an isolated incident. Jason's been a target for months." Malcolm's grip tightened around his phone. "Tell me everything." Saracen hesitated. "You sure you want to hear this right now? Your head's not in the right place." "Damn it, just tell me." Malcolm snapped, his voice low and dangerous. A deep sigh came from the other end of the line. "All right." Jason reported multiple incidents to the school administration. Physical and verbal abuse, locker vandalism, even a recorded threat sent to his phone. Malcolm's breath caught. "A threat?" "Yeah," Sent from an anonymous number, but I traced it. It came from Tyler Johnson's burner phone. The name sent another surge of anger through Malcolm. Tyler Johnson, a spoiled, entitled punk who thought his father's money and position on the school board made him untouchable. They cornered Jason in the locker room after gym class. Saracen continued. It wasn't a fight, Mal. It was an ambush. 3 against 1. Jason never stood a chance. Malcolm pressed his fingers against his temple. His heart pounded so hard it hurt. And the school? He asked through clenched teeth. Saracen's voice turned bitter. The school buried it. Dr. Simmons downplayed every complaint. He let those boys get away with everything. Turns out, Jason wasn't the first kid to be bullied under Simmons' watch, just the first one to land in a hospital bed. Malcolm's vision darkened. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the phone. Where are they now? He asked, his voice eerily calm. Saracen hesitated again. Free. Their parents lawyered up fast. No charges filed yet. Malcolm exhaled sharply, fighting the overwhelming urge to drive straight to Tyler Johnson's house and put the fear of God into the little bastard himself. But he couldn't. Not yet. Not for long, Malcolm said finally. They think they can get away with this. They have no idea who they're dealing with. There was a pause. You're a cop, Mal. You need to handle this the right way. Malcolm's jaw tensed. I'll do it the right way, he promised. But I will make them pay. A dark truth unfolds. By morning, Malcolm was back at Millbrook High. The school looked normal. Kids walking through the halls, laughing, chatting, carrying their books. But it wasn't normal. Not for Jason. Not for any kid who had been tormented inside these walls. Malcolm stormed into the principal's office without knocking. Dr. Simmons, a thin man with graying hair and cold, detached eyes, looked up from his desk, startled. Officer Reed, he said, forcing a polite smile. Malcolm slammed a folder onto his desk. Save it. I know everything, he growled. The cover-ups. The ignored complaints. The protection you've been giving these kids. Simmons paled. I don't know what you're talking about. Bullshit, Malcolm snapped, leaning over the desk. Jason came to you. He asked for help, and you did nothing. Simmons swallowed hard, his confidence wavering. Malcolm's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. Because of you, my son is fighting for his life. Because of you, 3 criminals are still walking these halls like nothing happened. Simmons opened his mouth, but Malcolm slammed his hand against the desk, making the man flinch. I've already contacted the school board, Malcolm said, his voice cold and lethal. I have enough evidence to prove that you covered this up. If you don't cooperate, I'll make sure you lose more than just your job. Simmons paled further. I didn't want this to happen, he stammered. They're families. They're powerful. If I pushed too hard, I could have lost my job. Your job, Malcolm repeated in disbelief. You were more worried about your damn job than the safety of the kids under your care. Simmons looked away. Malcolm exhaled sharply. Tell me everything. Now. Simmons hesitated only a moment before caving. The Johnsons, Delaney's and Hoffmans, they have influence, he admitted. I was pressured to downplay the reports. I didn't think it would go this far. Malcolm clenched his fists. It went too far the first time you ignored a victim. Simmons swallowed hard. What happens now? Malcolm's lips curled into a cold smirk. Now, you're going to resign. And you're going to help me make sure those kids face real consequences. Simmons paled further, but nodded. Fine, he whispered. I'll step down. Just, please don't ruin me. Malcolm leaned in. You ruined yourself. With that, he turned and walked out. Simmons was done. Now it was time to deal with the real criminals. The reckoning begins. That afternoon, Malcolm stood outside a lavish mansion, the Johnson estate. It was massive, sitting behind an iron gate, complete with security cameras, and a luxury car parked in the driveway. Malcolm pressed the intercom. A crisp voice answered. "Who is it?" "Officer Reed." "Open the gate." A pause. Then a click. The gates swung open. Tyler's father, Richard Johnson, met Malcolm at the door. The man was tall, well-dressed, and radiated arrogance. "Officer Reed," he greeted smoothly. "What an unexpected visit." Malcolm didn't waste time. "Your son and his friends put my boy in the hospital," he said, voice razor-sharp. "I want them arrested." Richard smirked. "I'm afraid that won't be happening." Malcolm stepped forward, his presence towering. "You think your money will protect him?" he asked softly. "You think I'll back down?" Richard's smirk faltered slightly. "You don't scare me," he scoffed. Malcolm's smile didn't reach his eyes. "You should be scared," he said darkly, "because I'm not just a cop. I'm a father, and I will destroy anyone who hurts my family." Richard stiffened. Malcolm leaned closer. "You have two choices. One, you cooperate, and your son faces justice the legal way. Or two, I make this very public. And trust me, the media loves a scandal." Richard swallowed hard. Malcolm smirked. "That's what I thought." Without another word, he turned and walked away. The case wasn't over. But justice was coming, and Malcolm would make damn sure his son's pain would not be in vain. The gathering storm. Malcolm Reed had spent his entire life enforcing the law, but now, as he drove through the streets of Millbrook, he realized something chilling. Justice wasn't always delivered in courtrooms. Sometimes it had to be dragged into the light, kicking and screaming. His son Jason was still unconscious in the hospital, clinging to life. And the boys responsible, Tyler Johnson, Marcus Delaney, and Chris Hoffman, they were still free, shielded by wealth and privilege. But Malcolm wasn't going to let them escape justice. Not this time. Not ever. The confrontation. Malcolm's first stop wasn't the police station. It wasn't the school either. It was the Delaney estate. The Delaneys weren't just rich. They were powerful. Marcus Delaney's mother, Evelyn Delaney, was a high-profile defense attorney who had made a career out of keeping rich criminals out of jail. As Malcolm pulled up to the towering gates of their mansion, he barely had to press the intercom before a guard approached his car. "Officer Reed," the man said, his tone professional but wary. "The Delaneys are not receiving visitors." Malcolm stepped out of his cruiser, his police badge glinting in the afternoon sun. "I'm not a visitor," he growled. "I'm here on official business." The guard hesitated. "You can tell Evelyn Delaney that she either lets me in, or I come back with a warrant," Malcolm added, his voice ice-cold. "Her choice." A moment later, the gate buzzed open. Malcolm walked up the long driveway, his hands clenched into fists. Evelyn Delaney was waiting for him on the porch, dressed in an immaculate white suit, her arms crossed. She was in her late 40s, with sharp eyes that had likely reduced many prosecutors to stammering fools in the courtroom. "Officer Reed," she said, her tone clipped. "I assume you're here about the unfortunate incident at Millbrook High." Unfortunate incident. Malcolm's blood boiled. "My son is in a hospital bed, fighting for his life," he said slowly. "And your damn kid helped put him there." Evelyn's face remained unreadable. "I sympathize with your situation. Truly. But Marcus has been advised not to speak on the matter." "Your son doesn't need to talk," Malcolm snapped. "The evidence speaks for itself." Evelyn arched an eyebrow. "And what evidence would that be, officer?" Malcolm took a step forward, towering over her. "You really think I don't have it? Security footage, witness statements, text messages. I know what Marcus did." Evelyn's jaw tightened. For the first time, she looked uneasy. "Charges will be filed," Malcolm continued. "And if you try to interfere, I'll make sure this goes federal. I'll have every media outlet in the state outside your house, demanding answers." Evelyn's expression darkened. "You think I'm afraid of bad press?" "No," Malcolm said. "But I think you're afraid of your clients seeing your name in the headlines next to the words cover-up." Silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Evelyn exhaled sharply. "I want my son to have legal representation." Malcolm smirked. "Oh, don't worry. He's going to need it." The pressure mounts. By the time Malcolm arrived back at the station, Detective Saracen was waiting for him. "You really pissed off some rich people today," Saracen said with a smirk, handing Malcolm a file. "Good," Malcolm replied, flipping it open. Inside were copies of police reports filed against Tyler Johnson, Marcus Delaney, and Chris Hoffman over the years. Most of them had been quietly dismissed. Vandalism, assault, cyberbullying. Even a previous hospital visit for another student last year, one that had been brushed under the rug. "Dr. Simmons covered up more than we thought," Saracen said, his voice grim. "He's been protecting these kids for years." Malcolm clenched his jaw. Not anymore. He turned to his partner. "File the charges. I want these kids in cuffs tonight." Saracen hesitated. "You know their families are going to throw everything they have at us, right? Lawyers, media spin, maybe even political favors." Malcolm's eyes darkened. "Let them try." The arrests. That evening, Malcolm was standing outside the Johnson estate when the patrol cars pulled up. Tyler Johnson was dragged out of his house, still in his designer sweatpants, his blonde hair messy from sleep. "Dad," he shouted as Richard Johnson stormed onto the front porch. "Do something." Richard's face was red with fury. "Officer Reed, this is outrageous. Your son is being arrested for assault with intent to cause grievous bodily harm." Malcolm interrupted coldly. "And when the evidence comes in, I'm pushing for attempted murder." Richard's face turned ghostly white. Tyler fought against the officers restraining him. "This is bullshit. Jason started it. We were just messing around." Malcolm stepped closer, his voice a quiet, deadly whisper. "Messing around," he repeated. "My son might not survive because of you." Tyler's mouth snapped shut. The officers dragged him to the patrol car. One down. Chris Hoffman was arrested next. His parents tried to bribe the officers. They were quickly informed that bribery was a felony. Two down. Marcus Delaney's arrest was the quietest. His mother, Evelyn, stood on the porch, watching as her son was taken away. She didn't say a word, but her hands were shaking. Three down. Justice was finally beginning. Back at the hospital, Malcolm returned to the hospital exhausted but satisfied. Martha met him in the hallway. "They got them?" she asked, her voice small. "They got them," Malcolm confirmed. Martha exhaled, tears spilling down her cheeks. "They're going to pay for what they did." Malcolm pulled her into his arms. "Yes," he whispered. "I promise you." Just then, a nurse rushed down the hall. "Officer Reed," she called. "Jason's waking up." Malcolm's heart nearly stopped. He bolted down the hallway, bursting into Jason's hospital room. And there, lying in the hospital bed, was his son, his eyes open, groggy but alive. "Dad?" Jason's voice was weak. Malcolm swallowed hard, tears burning his eyes. "Hey, buddy," he choked out, gripping his son's hand. "You're okay." Jason blinked up at him. They got them." Malcolm nodded. "Yeah, son, we got them." Jason let out a shuddering breath. "Good." Malcolm smiled through his tears. "Yeah, it is." Justice was coming, and it was just getting started. The war for justice. The sterile scent of antiseptic filled the hospital room as Jason blinked groggily, his consciousness slowly returning. His father, Malcolm Reed, sat beside him, gripping his son's hand as if he were afraid to let go. Jason's face was still swollen, his lips cracked, and bruises marred his skin. Machines beeped softly around him, a cruel reminder of how close he had come to death. But he was awake. And that was more than Malcolm had dared to hope for. "You're safe, buddy," Malcolm said, his voice thick with emotion. "We got them. Tyler, Marcus, and Chris. They're in custody." Jason swallowed, wincing. Even that small movement seemed to bring him pain. "They got arrested," he rasped. Malcolm nodded. "Yeah. And they're not getting out of this." A flicker of relief passed over Jason's face, but it was quickly overshadowed by something else. Doubt. Fear. "They won't stay in jail," Jason whispered. "They're parents. They'll buy them out. They always do." Malcolm's chest tightened. His son wasn't wrong. Justice wasn't guaranteed. Not when power and privilege could manipulate the system. But this time would be different. "I won't let that happen," Malcolm promised. "No more cover-ups. No more deals. They will pay for what they did to you." Jason didn't respond. He just turned his head slightly, staring at the IV drip in his arm. It wasn't enough. Not yet. The media firestorm. By the time Malcolm left the hospital the next morning, the world outside had changed. News vans were parked outside Millbrook High. Camera crews crowded the school gates, shoving microphones into the faces of students and teachers, desperate for a story. The headlines were brutal. Elite students arrested for brutal attack on officer's son. School board accused of cover-up. Millbrook scandal. How wealth and power silenced a victim. Until now. Jason Reed's fight for justice. A community in uproar. Malcolm barely had time to breathe before his phone rang. It was Detective Saracen. "Mal, we have a problem," Saracen said, his tone grim. "What now?" Malcolm asked, gripping the steering wheel. "The DA is getting pressure to drop the case," Saracen said. "The Johnsons, Delaney's, and Hoffmans are throwing everything they have at this. Their lawyers are claiming roughhousing gone wrong, and boys will be boys bullshit." Malcolm's vision blurred with fury. "Not happening," he growled. "We have evidence. We have medical reports." Jason almost died. Saracen sighed. "I know, but we both know how the system works. These families are pulling strings. They've got connections. If we don't fight this hard, they will walk." Malcolm exhaled sharply. He was going to war, and he needed reinforcements. The rally. That night, Malcolm called a town meeting. The community center was packed. Parents, students, teachers, journalists. Even Nancy, the nurse who had volunteered to donate part of her liver to Jason, was there. Malcolm stepped up to the podium. His hands gripped the edges, his knuckles white. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his voice carrying through the hall. "You all know why we're here." A hush fell over the crowd. "My son, Jason, was nearly beaten to death in that school," Malcolm continued, his voice raw with emotion. "But this isn't just about him. This is about every kid who has been bullied. Every kid who has suffered in silence because they thought no one would believe them." Murmurs spread through the crowd. "This is about a system that protects the wealthy instead of the victims," Malcolm continued, his anger building. "A system that ignored Jason's cries for help. A system that let his attackers walk free, until now." A murmur of agreement turned into applause. "We have a chance to change that," Malcolm said. "We can fight back. But we need everyone. We need you." Someone in the back shouted, "What can we do?" Malcolm's eyes burned with determination. "Make noise," he said. "Don't let them bury this. Flood the DA's office with calls. Demand justice. Post on social media. Write letters. Expose them. If they think they can silence us, they don't know who they're dealing with." A roar of approval surged through the crowd. The fight had begun. And Malcolm wasn't alone. The backlash. The next morning, Malcolm woke to death threats. Anonymous calls. Messages left on his windshield. "Drop the case, Reed, or your family pays the price. You don't know who you're messing with. Jason wasn't the only one who can get hurt." Malcolm's hands trembled as he read them. Then he laughed. They were scared. Good. Let them be. The turning point. The media attention worked. The DA's office was flooded with calls. Hashtag Justice for Jason was trending on social media. Public pressure mounted. And then, the final blow. A new witness came forward. One of the other students from Millbrook High, a sophomore named David Ellis. He had seen everything, and he had video proof. The video that changed everything. Malcolm sat in the police station with Saracen, watching the footage David had given them. The locker room. Jason was cornered. Tyler, Marcus, and Chris surrounded him, laughing. Then, the first punch. Jason stumbled back. Then another. And another. Jason tried to fight back, but he was outnumbered. They slammed him into the lockers, kicked him while he was down, laughed as he coughed up blood. Then, Tyler Johnson leaned down, grabbed Jason's shirt, and sneered. "This is your fault, Reed. You should have just shut up." Then, the final brutal kick to Jason's ribs. Malcolm turned off the video. He couldn't watch anymore. His fists clenched. His son had been left to die. This was attempted murder, and now the whole world would see it. The arrests. Round 2. Armed with undeniable proof, Malcolm and Saracen took the case straight to the district attorney. With the video evidence, the charges were upgraded from simple assault to attempted murder. This time, the judge had no choice. Tyler Johnson, no bail. Marcus Delaney, no bail. Chris Hoffman, no bail. The courtroom erupted when the verdict was read. Their families screamed. Their lawyers demanded appeals. But the judge was clear. Jason Reed had nearly died. And now, justice would be served. The aftermath. Jason was discharged from the hospital 2 weeks later. Still weak, still recovering, but alive. As Malcolm helped him into the car, Jason turned to him. "They're really going to prison?" Jason asked, his voice quiet. Malcolm nodded. "Yeah, they are." Jason was silent for a long time. Then he whispered, "It's finally over." Malcolm squeezed his shoulder. "No, son," he said. "This is just the beginning." Because this fight wasn't just for Jason. It was for every kid who had ever been bullied. For every voice that had been silenced. For justice. And Malcolm wasn't stopping until he changed the system for good. The battle for change. The victory in court was just the beginning. For Malcolm Reed, bringing Tyler Johnson, Marcus Delaney, and Chris Hoffman to justice wasn't enough. Their families had tried everything. Bribes, threats, political favors, to sweep the attack on Jason under the rug. But Malcolm had been relentless. He had fought back harder than they ever expected. And now, those 3 boys sat in a juvenile detention center, awaiting trial for attempted murder. But Malcolm wasn't done. Because this wasn't just about his son. This was about every victim who had been bullied, silenced, ignored. It was time to change the system for good. The corruption runs deeper. Malcolm sat across from Detective Saracen in the police station, his hands folded tightly together. They were reviewing case files. Reports of past bullying incidents at Millbrook High that had been conveniently dismissed over the years. "You were right," Saracen said, flipping through the pages. "Dr. Simmons didn't just ignore bullying. He covered it up. And he had help." Malcolm narrowed his eyes. "Who?" Saracen sighed. "The school board, the superintendent, even a few officers at the station." Malcolm sat back in his chair, exhaling sharply. "So this goes deeper than just one principal." Saracen nodded. "Way deeper. These families, they've been controlling things behind the scenes for years. Every time a student was bullied by the wrong people, meaning kids from rich families, the complaints were buried. Students transferred. Parents bought silence." Malcolm clenched his fists. "And Jason nearly died because of it." Saracen nodded grimly. "But here's the thing," he continued. "Now that the media is involved, now that the public is demanding action, we have leverage." Malcolm leaned forward. "So we push." Saracen smirked. Hard. The fight goes public. That night, Malcolm sat at the kitchen table with Martha and Jason. His son was still weak, his ribs bandaged, his movements slow. But the fire in his eyes, that hadn't dimmed. "Jason," Malcolm said gently, "I need to ask you something important." Jason straightened, alert. "You don't have to do this," Malcolm continued, "but if you're willing, I want you to speak out. Publicly. I want you to tell your story." Jason blinked. "Like on the news?" Malcolm nodded. "Yes. We need to put pressure on the school district, the city, the entire system. The more people hear your voice, the harder it'll be for them to ignore this." Jason hesitated, glancing at his mother. Martha reached out, squeezing his hand. "It's your choice, sweetheart. But no matter what, we stand by you." Jason exhaled. Then, slowly, he nodded. "I'll do it," he said. "If it helps other kids, I'll do it." Malcolm smiled, pride swelling in his chest. "All right," he said. "Let's get to work." Jason's story breaks the internet. 2 days later, Malcolm sat next to Jason in the studio of a local news station. The interview started softly. The reporter, a woman in her 40s named Linda Carter, leaned forward. "Jason, can you tell us what happened that day?" Jason hesitated, his fingers clenching slightly, but then he told the world everything. The threats, the fear, the moment the punches started, how he tried to fight back, but there were 3 of them, how they laughed as he struggled to breathe, how he thought he was going to die on that locker room floor. By the time he finished, the studio was silent. Linda's eyes were glassy with unshed tears. "Jason, what do you want to happen now?" Jason inhaled sharply. "I want schools to actually protect students. I want teachers to stop ignoring bullying. I want people to understand that this is more than just kids being kids. It's life or death." The broadcast went viral overnight. #JusticeForJason exploded online. Thousands of bullied students began sharing their own stories. Then came the petitions, the protests, and soon, the school board had no choice but to respond. The school board faces the storm. Malcolm stood in a packed meeting hall as the Millbrook School Board sat stiffly in their seats, glaring at him. The superintendent, a gray-haired man named Daniel Whitmore, cleared his throat. "Officer Reed, while we sympathize with your situation, I'm afraid there's only so much we can." "Bullshit," Malcolm cut in. Gasps echoed through the room. Whitmore's face reddened. "Excuse me?" "You knew what was happening," Malcolm continued coldly. "You knew that Dr. Simmons covered up bullying reports. You knew that wealthy students got away with everything. And you let it happen." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Malcolm slammed a folder onto the table. "This is every report that was ignored, every complaint dismissed, every victim silenced." Whitmore's hands shook as he flipped through the documents. "You're going to fix this," Malcolm growled. "You're going to rewrite your policies, implement actual consequences, and fire every staff member who let this happen. Or I will take every single parent here and sue the living hell out of this district." Silence. Then, "We demand change," a voice called out. Malcolm turned. It was Nancy, the nurse who had nearly given part of her liver to save Jason. "Yeah," someone else yelled. "Fix the system." The room erupted. And in that moment, the school board realized they had lost. The change begins. 3 days later, the board fired Dr. Simmons. They passed strict anti-bullying policies. Students were given confidential ways to report abuse. New disciplinary measures were put in place. And Malcolm, he wasn't done. He worked with local politicians to propose a statewide bill, Jason's Law. If passed, it would make covering up bullying incidents a criminal offense. Teachers, principals, even school board members would be held legally accountable. And within a month, the bill passed. A new beginning. 6 weeks later, Malcolm and Jason stood outside Millbrook High. Jason's body was still healing, his scars still visible. But when he looked at his father, he smiled. "They can't ignore kids like me anymore, can they?" Jason asked. Malcolm shook his head, a proud grin on his face. "No, son, they can't." And as they walked toward the school, toward a better future, Malcolm knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just their victory. It was a victory for every kid who had ever been afraid to speak up. And now, the world was finally listening. A legacy of strength. The cold morning air bit at Malcolm Reed's skin as he stood in front of Millbrook High, staring at the entrance that had once symbolized pain and betrayal for his son. Now, it was different. Now, it was a battleground that had been won. It had been 6 months since Jason's brutal attack. 6 months since Malcolm had exposed the corruption within the school. 6 months since the arrests of Tyler Johnson, Marcus Delaney, and Chris Hoffman, 3 privileged boys who had believed they were untouchable. But justice had finally caught up to them. The sentencing, the moment that changed everything. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, parents, activists, even students from Millbrook High had come, eager to see if justice would truly be served. Malcolm sat beside Jason, his son still showing faint scars from the attack. Though Jason had physically recovered, Malcolm knew that some wounds weren't visible. Across the room, the 3 defendants sat with their high-powered lawyers. Their parents had spared no expense, hoping money would buy their children freedom. But not this time. The judge's voice rang through the courtroom. The court finds Tyler Johnson, Marcus Delaney, and Chris Hoffman guilty of assault with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Given the severity of the injuries sustained by the victim and the overwhelming evidence provided, I am sentencing each defendant to 5 years in juvenile detention, followed by mandatory rehabilitation and community service. Gasps filled the room. The boys' parents exploded. "Your Honor, this is outrageous." Richard Johnson stood up, red-faced with fury. These boys were just roughhousing. Malcolm stood up, his voice cutting through the noise. "My son almost died because of them," he growled. "And you want to call it roughhousing?" The judge banged the gavel. "Sit down, Mr. Johnson, or I will hold you in contempt of court." Richard sat, shaking with rage. Tyler, Marcus, and Chris sat frozen, realization dawning. For the first time in their privileged lives, there were consequences. Jason turned to Malcolm, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dad," he said, "it's finally over." Malcolm squeezed his son's hand. "Yeah, son, it is." The community rises, but Malcolm knew that punishing the attackers wasn't enough. If he wanted real change, it had to start at the foundation. So he took action. 1. The new school system. With public pressure mounting, the Millbrook School Board had no choice but to implement strict new policies. A no-tolerance bullying policy. Any student caught bullying would immediately face suspension and a permanent record entry. Mandatory empathy and conflict resolution training. Every student had to attend monthly workshops on emotional intelligence. Confidential reporting system. A new anonymous hotline was set up, ensuring that no student had to suffer in silence. It wasn't just a policy change, it was a complete overhaul of the system. 2. Jason's law goes statewide. Malcolm's next move. Making it bigger. His fight wasn't just for Jason anymore. It was for every child who had been bullied, beaten, and ignored. With the help of local politicians, he pushed for new legislation. Jason's Law, which criminalized the deliberate cover-up of bullying incidents by school administrators. The law passed within months. Now, any school that failed to act on bullying complaints would face legal consequences. Schools across the state scrambled to comply. Because now, ignoring a bullied child could cost them their job. Jason's next step, turning pain into purpose. One day, Jason walked into Malcolm's office with a serious expression. "Dad," he said, I know what I want to do with my life." Malcolm set his coffee down. "All right, kid. Let's hear it." Jason took a deep breath. "I want to help kids like me," he said. "I want to become a counselor." Malcolm blinked. "You mean, like a school counselor?" Jason shook his head. "Not just that. I want to talk to kids who are scared to speak up. I want to show them they don't have to be alone." Pride swelled in Malcolm's chest. "You'd be damn good at it," he said, "and I'll help you every step of the way." The final reckoning. Dr. Simmons faces justice. Malcolm hadn't forgotten about Dr. Simmons, the former principal of Millbrook High who had allowed Jason's abuse to continue. So, he kept digging. And what he found was worse than he expected. Dr. Simmons had covered up more than just Jason's case. There were dozens of other victims. Some had even dropped out of school because of the bullying they endured. Malcolm exposed everything. The school board was forced to take action. Dr. Simmons, he was banned from working in education. And soon, he was charged with obstruction of justice. Jason's case had shattered the old system. And from its ashes, a new, stronger one was being built. A year later, a speech that changed lives. 1 year after the attack, Jason stood on a stage. In front of him, a crowd of thousands. Parents, students, teachers, police, even politicians. They had gathered for a new anti-bullying conference, an event named after Jason himself. Jason looked out at the audience. He took a deep breath. Then he spoke. "A year ago, I was left bleeding on a locker room floor," he said. "I thought I was alone. I thought no one would hear me." He paused. But I was wrong. The crowd stilled. People stood up. They fought for me. They fought for every kid who has been silenced. And now we're fighting back. Applause erupted. Jason's eyes shone with emotion. "We're not just here to talk," he continued. "We're here to change the future. Together." More cheers. Malcolm stood in the crowd, his heart swelling with pride. His son wasn't a victim anymore. He was a leader. The final chapter. A family united. That night, Malcolm, Jason, and Martha sat on their back porch, watching the stars. "Crazy year, huh?" Jason said with a smirk. Malcolm chuckled. "Yeah, kid, but we made it through." Jason's smile softened. "Thanks for fighting for me, Dad." Malcolm's throat tightened. "Always," he said, "and I always will." Martha reached over, taking both of their hands. "As a family," she whispered. As they sat there, under the vast night sky, Malcolm knew one thing. Their battle had been hard. The scars would never fully fade. But they had won. And now they were building a future where no child would suffer in silence ever again. The fight that changed everything. The night air was crisp as Malcolm Reed sat on his back porch, staring up at the endless stretch of stars. His wife, Martha, sat beside him, her fingers laced through his. Inside, Jason had finally gone to sleep after an exhausting day. His body had healed, but his journey was far from over. It had been a long battle, a battle for justice, change, and accountability. And they had won. But Malcolm knew that even though Jason's attackers had been punished and Jason's law had been passed, there were still battles to fight. Other kids, just like Jason, were still suffering in silence. That's why he wasn't stopping. Not now. Not ever. A new beginning. The Reed Foundation. 2 months after Jason's powerful speech, Malcolm and Martha finalized something they had been working on for weeks. The Reed Foundation. A nonprofit organization dedicated to helping victims of bullying get legal support, providing therapy and counseling for struggling students, training teachers and parents on how to recognize warning signs, giving victims a platform to share their stories. The foundation launched with overwhelming public support. Donations flooded in. Schools across the country adopted new policies inspired by Jason's story. Even survivors of past bullying incidents came forward, sharing their experiences. It was bigger than Jason now. It was a movement. And Jason, he wasn't just a survivor anymore. He was a symbol of change, the final showdown, facing the past. One afternoon, as Jason was reviewing applications for a new youth ambassador program at the foundation, a notification popped up on his phone. New visitor request, Tyler Johnson. Jason's stomach tightened. His former attacker, the boy who had nearly ended his life, was requesting to speak with him. Jason hesitated. Then he took a deep breath. It's time to face this. The meeting took place in a secure visitor center at the juvenile detention facility. Jason sat on one side of the table. Tyler sat on the other. The last time they had been this close, Jason had been on the ground, coughing up blood. Now, the power dynamic had shifted. Tyler looked different, thinner, paler. His once arrogant posture was gone. Jason met his gaze, waiting. Finally, Tyler exhaled sharply. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said, his voice rough. "But I needed to say it. I'm sorry. For everything." Jason didn't say anything. Because words meant nothing without action. Tyler's jaw tensed. "I was a coward. I thought I was untouchable. And now I see what I really was. A bully. A monster." Jason's fingers curled into a fist. He had dreamed of this moment. The moment when Tyler would finally understand the damage he had done. But now that it was here, he didn't feel anger. He didn't feel hate. He just felt tired. "What do you want from me?" Jason finally asked. Tyler swallowed. "I want to help. When I get out of here, I want to talk to kids like me. I want to tell them what I did, what it cost me. I want to stop other kids from turning into what I became." Jason studied him. For the first time, he believed him. Not fully. Not yet. But someday. Maybe. "You'll have to prove it," Jason said, standing up. "With actions, not words." Tyler nodded. "I know." Then Jason turned and walked away, leaving his past behind him. 1 year later, a legacy that lives on. 1 year later, Jason stood in front of the White House. He had been invited to speak at a national summit on youth protection laws. As he looked out over the crowd, he saw thousands of people, students, parents, teachers, lawmakers, all gathered because of a fight that had started in a high school locker room. "A year ago, I was just another kid," Jason said, his voice steady. "A kid who thought he had to suffer in silence. A kid who thought no one would listen." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But I was wrong. People did listen. People stood up. And today, I stand here because of them, because of my parents, because of my community, because we decided that enough was enough." Applause. We changed laws. We held people accountable. And now we're building a future where no student will have to suffer alone. More applause. Jason's heart pounded, but not with fear, with pride. Because this was his purpose. The final chapter. A family that stood together. That evening, Malcolm, Martha, and Jason sat on their porch, watching the sunset. It had been a long year. A painful year. But also a victorious one. "So," Malcolm said, smirking, "you're a national speaker now, huh?" Jason laughed. "Guess so." Martha smiled, squeezing Jason's hand. "We're so proud of you, sweetheart." Jason exhaled, looking at them. "I couldn't have done this without you guys." Malcolm's throat tightened. They had been through hell, but they had made it, together. And as the sky darkened, Jason whispered one final thing. "No kid should ever have to go through what I did." Malcolm nodded. "And because of you, they won't." Jason smiled, because he knew, deep in his heart, that it was true. The fight had been hard, but they had won. Not just for Jason, but for every bullied kid who had ever felt alone. And that was a legacy that would last forever.